parental lawsuit risk in mental health is extremely low. But that doesn't mean that we don't have this history of parent blame and a dysfunctional, underfunded, fragmented collection of services that some people call a system.
Any new research coming out?
Yes, I've got great news on this.
Great.
On September the 26th, the FDA is going to rule on a new compound which has a completely different mechanism of action.
Dr. Ken Duckworth is the NAMI Chief Medical Officer and also author of NAMI's first book, You Are Not Alone, the NAMI Guide to Navigating Mental Health. We'll talk about parent liability, new research, and more on this, our first episode of Season 5. Welcome to our podcast, Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. From the place where schizophrenia and real life collide. East Coast, West Coast, Middle America. With Miriam Feldman, Mindy Greiling, and Randy Kay. Finally, a place to talk about the truth. Welcome to our 5th season of Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. We're so excited you're here. If you're counting the episodes, it's number 101. So that makes season 5. I'm Randy Kay, author of Ben Behind His Voices, here with Mindy Greiling, author of Fix What You Can, and Miriam Feldman, author of He Came In With It. And we are 3 moms, 3 sons with schizophrenia, and we're turning our roller coaster journey into as much advocacy as we can with the help of expert guests. In a moment, we're going to bring on someone we've been hoping to have on the podcast for about 100 episodes. So excited to have Dr. Ken Duckworth, the NAMI Chief Medical Officer, NAMI Chief Medical Officer, to kick off this season 5. But first, let's do a quick catch up. If you're new to the podcast, and you have a loved one with schizophrenia or another serious mental illness, you probably know it's a roller coaster. And in that spirit, we share a little bit of our roller coaster. So, Mindy, let's start with you because we know Jim had pneumonia and that there was kind of a regression there. How's he doing now? How are you doing too?
Well, yeah, we all are doing as well as our children are doing. So there's that. But Jim has not really recovered from his pneumonia. And then also by, as you know, taking him overseas a week after he got out of the hospital. And Dr. Duckworth actually warned me about psychosis on the plane going that from west to east. And sure enough, that happened, and actually coming home again from east to west. So we had that for Jim to recover from as well. And he just hasn't bounced back. He hasn't been to work for 2 months, and he's having trouble actually even walking steadily and so forth. So we're working closely with his great psychiatrist or Dr. Laitman, and hope we can get him out of it soon, because it really drags us all down, as we know, when our family members aren't doing well.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear that. And do I detect a little guilt?
Yes, lots of guilt.
It comes with the parenting territory.
I know it. Yes,
I know.
Yes,
I feel
yes.
you. I feel you, friend. Mimi, how about you? How's Nick? And how's everyone?
Kind of similar story, not quite so acute, but I have to say this pneumonia thing, it is so serious, pneumonia, and the ripples in the pond from pneumonia. Everybody needs to take it really seriously. I had no idea. Nick was in the ICU 3 years ago. He was in the ICU for 31 days. It was very serious, and it took him a long time to get back. It screwed up his meds. It was terrible. And he's okay. He's not, we've had a rough couple of weeks. It's just a bump in the road, I guess. I haven't been able to pin it to anything, but he doesn't seem to be himself, and he's not wanting to do anything. With Nick, what happens are, if negative things can flare, the negative symptoms flare. He doesn't have positive symptoms anymore, but when we hit a rough patch, he just sort of goes into himself. So that's what we've been dealing with. And also some caregiver issues ourselves, with people, caregivers changing and not showing up and things like that. So it's just been a tough couple of weeks.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that as well. Yeah, it's When I wrote my book, I was trying to think of something that wasn't roller coaster to describe, but I think roller coaster kind of says it best. I think I came up with merry-go-round and every time you can't catch the ring. I don't remember what analogy I came up with, but it certainly are bumps in the road and twists and turns and detours and all that. But there's also positives. And as I mentioned at the end of season 4, at the moment, I'm daring to hope because I don't think there's any shame in hoping. At the moment, Ben is 9 days away from hopefully graduating from a jail diversion program. He's very, very excited. He's a little too excited in a way in that he wants to spend all his money and buy things for the apartment. I mean, this is kind of hilarious to me because this person who, when he was a teenager, thought taking a shower was a terrible idea and that the devil, whatever would happen, whatever psychosis and belief he had about showers, he would go months without showering. He wouldn't wash his hair. He wore the same overalls for 2 weeks. Now he's suddenly interested in being stylish. So that is a word I never thought would come out of his mouth. And so kind of trying to laugh about it, except that he likes to shop for sneakers that are, $100-200 a pair. And I have to tell him not to do that. He's like, well, it's my money. I'm like, well, you want to save for a car. Anyway, but compared to where we were a year ago when he was incarcerated for something I now believe he didn't do because he just looked guilty. We're in a good place right now. I'm excited. I'm hopeful. And I never want to not be hopeful because worst that'll happen is I'll be wrong, but at least I will have spent some time in hope. So there you go.
That's a good ending story for us.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, that's just like, what goes around doesn't always come around, but sometimes it does. So I hope given time, and the brain is part of the body. So if you get pneumonia, it doesn't just affect your lungs. It affects, there are secondary symptoms of any illness. And when your brain is involved, there can be brain changes as well. So I hope that the recovery for both of you guys includes more hope and good movement in the other direction. So in the news today, there was a story of a couple of parents who were deemed not liable in a 2018 rampage where their son was a shooter. And we've spoken many times about the fact of associating schizophrenia with shooters. It's not a fair thing to do, but often there is, let's say, some mental health problems involved. And lately, a lot in the news, there was a couple of parents that were found liable, but in this case today, they were not found liable. And they found that the person who sold the shooter ammunition was the one that's liable. So it brings us to the guilt and to the caregivers. How much can we do for our loved ones? How much can't we do? I know I'll be going back to Al-Anon when my son gets out of his program where he is required to be sober. And one of the things is this book, You Are Not Alone, by Dr. Ken Duckworth and many contributors to remind us how to navigate the mental health system and also that we're not alone. There's a lot of really good advice for caregivers, including, am I a bad parent? Was this my fault? So with that in mind, let's bring Dr. Ken Duckworth, the NAMI Chief Medical Officer. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Randy. And I just want to say your sons are very fortunate to have you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. What we do for love, right out of
for
chorus
love,
line, right?
Yeah.
So why don't we start? I'm going to ask your opinion about the parental liability in a moment, but let's get to know you a little bit first. So right there on the NAMI website, people can hear a little bit of your story and in the book as well, but tell us a little bit about why you do the work that you do.
Yeah, so I was a regular kid and there was no family history of anyone becoming a doctor or a mental health practitioner. That was not a thing. In moving to Boston and training at Harvard, I've met many people whose parents, the multi-generational physicians, that wasn't my story. So I'm 8 years old and I'm playing in the basement and I hear these booming sounds upstairs. And I look upstairs and enough time to see a policeman taking my dad away. So this is in Philadelphia. Our family had been there for many years. And about 6 months later, we're in a U-Haul driving to Michigan where we know no one. And 8-year-old me is like, does this have something to do with that? Because nobody's talking about it, of course. This is the 1960s. And so it was unimaginable that you would discuss it, particularly with an 8-year-old child. So I grew up in Michigan. I go to the University of Michigan. I'm a polite driver. I believe in public education. I like college football. Some of these things kind of stuck with me. But to make a long story short, I made a decision to become a psychiatrist to make sense of what this was. So my dad had very bad bipolar 1, intermittently quite psychotic, intermittently complete lack of awareness of illness, which is why my core interest has been in people who are sicker, people with psychotic illness, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, depression with psychosis, to a lesser extent, borderline personality disorder with transient psychosis and a lot of self-harm. So that's kind of my core interest. And in finding NAMI, it's been really a great blessing for me because I do a lot of teaching and advocacy and activity related to what I'm interested in. I've also done everything else a person can do in psychiatry. I ran Harvard's Community Mental Health Center. I was the state medical director. I was the commissioner of mental health. I worked for a health plan, liberalizing all their benefits and realizing just how impossible all that is. I worked on an assertive community treatment, a dual diagnosis program. I've tried to do everything. I ran a Clos Upine clinic. I tried to do everything I could do as a doctor here in Boston to inform my work for NAMI. I happen to work, in DC. This grossly dysfunctional way to run your life. Do not recommend living in the different city of where you're. So I would, back in the day, there was US Air, and I used to hop planes, and people would say, Ken, what do you do? Like in seat 12A. Pre-pandemic, people used to speak to each other, right? And you'd say, what do you do? Oh, I'm doing sales for such and such, or I'm writing a grant for such and such. And I work for the National Alliance of NAMI. And they'd say, what's NAMI? And then I would tell them. And about half the people had no response at all. But about half of them would say, of course, my brother, my father, my son. And I thought, and then I'd meet 1 in 100 people who'd say, NAMI saved my life. Family to family saved my marriage, for example. And I thought somebody should write NAMI's book because it should be easy to get in the library. It should be easy to find. And I'm going to be the one who does that. Now, it took me about 15 years. I just want to emphasize you had to line up a lot of things within NAMI because I gave them the copyright. They get the royalties. So you got to get the board on board. You have to have a CEO who believes in you. You kind of got to get everything right. So I was kind of fortunate that everything actually did line up after nothing lined up. And the radical idea is that real people use their names and share their experience. Because I believe if you've loved someone for 20 years, you've probably learned something. And if you've lived with something for a decade, you've probably learned something. And that was the radical idea of the book. And nobody else had done that. So when doctors write books, it's all about the doctor's knowledge per square, usually. And they anonymize everyone and change their identity, protect their innocence, all that kind of stuff. And so I wanted to flip that on its head because I've met so many amazing people like the three of you, just in the concert of my work. It's just like there's all these people who want to share what they've learned to turn their pain into purpose. And this, of course, is the great secret of hanging out at NAMI. I'm like, I could find 1,000 people. I had to stop at 130 because I was on a deadline. But you want to be in NAMI, Wisconsin. Anybody want to be in the book? You have to use your name. Think about it. Talk about it over dinner. Don't call me for a week. Think about this because your name is going to be associated with, your experience. And so we did a second printing after we sold 50,000 books. We did a second printing and I gave people the option to get out. Nobody wants to get out. And we're doing the paperback this January. Guys, anybody? We're like, oh no, I'm going to sell more books. Let's go. So it's very sweet. So this little community of 130 people, I give them updates on what's happening and they all feel part of it. I'm going to South Carolina next week and Betsy O'Brien, who's, a big Clos Upine advocate. I don't know if she overlaps with your world. She's going to be on a little stage with me and we'll sign 50 books together. So everywhere I go across the country, I try to get the person that I interviewed with me on the stage. And the people who sign the books in Connecticut are from Connecticut, and the people who sign the books in Boston are from Boston.
I love that. I love the community that it's creating. And And, this what we are trying to do, turn pain into purpose. We have had
Yeah.
so many guests on who've lost their loved ones or their
Yes.
marriages have split up. We've had success stories on here.
Yeah.
But it's people sharing their stories, which really helps. And so if you're watching on YouTube, you see it, I'm holding it up. You are not alone. If you're listening in your car or on your walk or washing the dishes or however you listen to the podcast, know that in the show notes, there are links and it'll take you straight to the Amazon site for the book. Of course, as Ken said, you can get it in the libraries and in bookstores as well. And we'll send you in the show notes a link to the NAMI website, NAMI.org. So
that's my little story. So
yeah, okay, finish your story, and then I
I'm an
want to hear
accidental psychiatrist obsessed with lived experience as expertise. I wanted to become a journalist or a history professor, and in a way, through this project, I'm activating journalism and history recessive genes within me. So
isn't it wonderful when you can combine two interests with
I
doing
feel
one thing?
very blessed, Mindy. And in finding this community, there really wasn't that many places where having this experience was a plus. I want to emphasize that. When I applied to become a psychiatrist, they ignored my essay. I extremely naively told the truth. I don't think you're supposed to tell the truth. I think
You mean
you're
about
supposed
your
to...
dad? You told the
Yeah,
story
why I
about your
wanted to
dad?
become a psychiatrist was the prompt. I actually made the mistake of telling the truth. So my essay was ignored all across America. People would talk to me about medical cases and college football. I was from the University of Michigan. Nobody wanted to talk about it. I go to a world famous Harvard place, and the guy says, "This is a terrible reason to become a psychiatrist." And I say, "I'm 26 years old. I know no one. I want to emphasize this. I'm a no one. And I just graduated from medical school. And I'm like, this isn't going to work. I'm going to have to become a cardiologist. They drive better cars anyway. Society seems to value that, whatever." And so I left that day in tears. I asked him what was a better reason to become a psychiatrist. And he paused for a minute. I don't think people asked world famous psychiatrists at that hospital many questions. And he paused for a minute. He says, "Well, maybe if your father's a psychiatrist, that's a good reason." So this guy was not thinking about the workforce problem that we face, where it's impossible to find anyone to take care of somebody you love. And so the next day, I thought, well, I'm just going to hang it up. And next day, I went to the Massachusetts Mental Health Center, and a guy named Ned Halliwell said, "This is fantastic. My dad had bipolar disorder. We know so much more. We have a whole nother dimension of this." I moved to Boston. I'm still on the faculty at the exact same place. People just need to be affirmed. He's the only person who read my essay and didn't
That's a
ignore it.
great story,
It's
too.
a true story. And it's
Yeah.
a biopsy of 1986. I mean, we're talking a long time ago, but then you still run into people who say, "I got turned down by a medical school in the Midwest because I talked about my sister dying by suicide." And they're like, "We don't want this story this isn't part of our culture." So we still have work to do. I do think it's getting better.
Absolutely. What happened with your dad eventually, by the way?
So my dad died at age 87, and he never talked about his illness. He was loving and fun. So I was never mistreated. So I was very fortunate to have a loving, fun dad who was periodically psychotic, communicating with the microwave oven, picked up by the police, naked in front of the house. I want to emphasize I had the full experience every couple of years. We never figured out the pattern. We never did any. NAMI hadn't been invented yet. Like, it was just, I was a jump. But on his deathbed, I'm not making this up, he said to me, "I'm really sorry about all those hard times." I mean, nobody who gets that. And that was the most beautiful little interaction. And he didn't want to discuss it further. And I said, "I'm sorry too." That was it.
That sounds like my grandmother who had schizophrenia. And when I was doing the family history and asking her questions, she wanted to make sure I didn't put anything in there about her having schizophrenia.
That's right.
You can see to the listeners and Randy and Mimi why Dr. Duckworth Ken was one of my favorites at NAMI when I was on the NAMI board. And I tell him this story, but to tell the listeners, back when I was on the board, which was like 20 some years ago, he always put on a tuxedo and was the MC for our big last nights at the conventions, and just a very striking figure, as well as so personable and caring about telling your story and so forth. So thank
Mindy,
you for all your years at NAMI.
Never volunteer to do a task. So the guy didn't show up the one year, and they said, Ken, can you bring a tuxedo and be the MC? And I'm like, sure, I can do that. I'll do it one time. I think I did it for the next 16 years.
Oh my
I mean,
gosh.
because, oh, you're that guy. And so, it's all good, Mindy. It's all good.
So, thank you for that. That's, now I feel like I'm talking to a friend as well as a well-trained and caring psychiatrist. So, Ken, just what's your take on all these court cases? And of course, these make the news, but this movement to blame parents. And some cases are finding parents liable for neglect. Look, I live a stone's throw from Newtown, Connecticut, where Sandy Hook happened.
Yeah, of course.
And I know people who know the family of the young man who did this unspeakable crime. And I also remember at the time reading about him, and that the mother, like, I remember reading that she took her son to and I don't think he had schizophrenia. He was on the autism spectrum. There were a lot of things going on with him, but and she would take him to the shooting range because he smiled when he was there. Like, it was, and at that moment, I had some empathy for her, probably knowing nothing. Like, she definitely turned down some of the help that her son could get, but she also reached out for help, and it wasn't the right help. He did Boy Scouts. I think she tried, but I think she didn't know how to do it. So this and the guns were locked up, and somehow he unlocked it. So obviously that ended incredibly tragically, and including her death. So there was no liability there. But what do you think about finding some parents liable? Like, what does this say
Couple of
about?
thoughts. Let's take some step back. So my predecessors in psychiatry used to blame mothers for their children's schizophrenia. That is an established and brutal fact, and is a great disgrace. I don't know if you've ever seen the PBS show When Medicine Got It Wrong. It's kind of fantastic. It's interviews with people who experience this. This is kind of the story. Very hard to find now. I tried to buy one to prep for the book. But it was called When Medicine Got It Wrong. And it was written by a woman on the West Coast, and she did like a documentary of psychiatrists blaming mothers. So, of course, this becomes the origin story of NAMI. Right. The origin story is 284 people meet in Wisconsin, and most of them are moms. Most of them are feeling blamed. At the same time, they're closing mental health services, state hospitals, and sending them home. So it's both the responsibility and the blame. And so, this is the complex legacy, which nobody is taught that now. But it wasn't hard for me to find people in the book who had been blamed. Right. I didn't want to make the book all about anti-professionalism. I found people who were told they'd never get better. I tried to limit it to a section or two of the book, because we have no powers of prediction in our field, and we don't understand causation. And it would just be really helpful to remember those things. Like, we've learned some things, we know some things, but we can't predict your future. We really can't. I was told by a world famous psychiatrist that this man that I was taking care of would never leave the hospital. And then Clos Upine reemerged back in America in 1989. I was part of the Clos Upine research team. Gave this guy Clos Upine. His symptoms settle right down. I'm not saying he's cured. He can leave the hospital. And again, the world famous person had told me 6 months ago, Smith will never leave the hospital. I'm like, well, how do you know? You have no idea. Smith could find love, a job, a medicine. Like, I don't know what's going to happen to him. I'm just going to try to treat him with kindness and respect. So anyway, so this conversation around blame has to be thought of in that context, right? The history of blame. But I want to say I did forensic training, and for 10 years I was boarded in forensic psychiatry. Then I got tired of taking exams. I just simply fatigued of it. Like, you can imagine, right? How many exams can you take in a lifetime? So I just let it lapse. So I think I say I'm forensic trained. Each case is individual. It's extremely rare for a parent to be found, accountable for their child's actions. And I would say in the rare instances, the parent would have to be behaving 3 or 4 standard deviations away from the mean, just as doctors who get sued. Doctors get sued, but unless you're doing extremely malpractice level things, doctors are not held accountable. Bad things
I'd like to
happen.
follow up on that because, as you said, this is a rare case when parents are so terrible that they actually can, both parents, in this Michigan case that Randy mentioned, they were
Yeah.
both convicted of 4 felonies. And so that is very rare, but it was such
Super
an open
rare.
and shut, blatant case. But turn it around, as you said, and how I often think the mental health system in some states especially is so terrible that maybe a wake-up call lawsuit on the other end of things would cause people to try harder to work on HIPAA or try harder to get early intervention for people. But I have one case of a friend of mine where her son, she and her husband kept telling the doctors how very sick he was, that they were worried about him, what he was doing, and they thought he was vulnerable for harming himself. And then sure enough, he did harm himself in a very graphic way, not suicide, but marred for life. And they tried to get an attorney to help them sue these. I don't know if they're trying to sue the doctor or the system, but they couldn't get anyone to take the case. And the father was an attorney, is an attorney. So have you ever heard of anybody ever being able to get any kind of lawsuit going for they're banging on the door to get help, but people just will not listen to families?
Oh, there are lawsuits. Doctors lose them occasionally. They usually have to behave in ways that are extremely outside of the usual standard of care. And I just want to emphasize, psychiatry lawsuit risk is low. Obstetric lawsuit risk is high. Parental lawsuit risk in mental health is extremely low. But that doesn't mean that we don't have this history of parent blame and a dysfunctional, underfunded, fragmented collection of services that some people call a system, which it's not a system. It's a fragmented, chaotic, organic, ever-changing collection of services, right? That's what it is, that are not integrated, not designed together, and I've worked in, I think, every corner of it that I could think of. And I've just never seen anything so chaotic and patchwork. One thing I do want to mention on violence, I have a seminar I run every month called Ask the Expert at NAMI. And if you just Google NAMI Ask the Expert, and I get amazing people. I had Javier Amador, I had Mary Ellen Copeland on the Wellness Recovery Action Plan. I had Bob Drake on supported employment. I had a man that I trained with when I was young named Eric Elbogen. And Eric reviews all the literature on mental illness and violence and correctly concludes that there is about 15 factors more salient than a history of mental illness and violence. That, alcohol, parental neglect, on and on and on. And this is available on the web. All of them are recorded.
Are they on YouTube? Like, where do they? So if you Google NAMI Ask the Expert, it'll take you to
It'll
YouTube.
take you to my magic page, and you can hear Javier Amador on anosognosia.
Awesome.
Or, I make a real effort to cover the waterfront of ideas and perspectives. So how people
I think those are excellent. And I did go and listen to the one on violence because you referred me to
Eric. Yeah, by Eric Elwood.
You were
He's
talking
a smart
about
dude. Yeah.
this episode, and I thought that one was very good. And it did bring up the issue of once you add substance abuse to mental illness, all of a sudden you've got a much more, 4 times, I think it was, apt to be violence as if it was just a person with mental illness. So that, however, is an awful lot of people with mental illnesses who do end up abusing substances, which is why I think we have to try harder to get people help than we do in our current system. Yeah. But that was a very good, a good program.
So these are all free. They're all available. So if you want to hear Javier Amador on anosognosia, if you want to hear Eric Elbogen on the lack really of a relationship between mental illness and violence, you want to hear Mary Ellen Copeland, who invented the Wellness Recovery Action Plan. I used to have Marshall Linehan on a phone call. I had Marshall Linehan, who invented DBT, and 1,300 people on one phone line. Dogs are barking. People are doing their dishes. Like, I've got the world's most famous person in this entire self-harm space. And it was so NAMI. It was unbelievable. So about 8 years ago.
Can you describe DBT for people who don't know what it is?
DBT is a psychotherapy to help people who self-harm due to dysregulation of emotion. So Marcia actually told me that she thought it should not be called borderline personality disorder. It should be called dysregulatory disorder.
Okay.
And
I'm
sorry, Mindy.
And I want to give Mimi a chance because she's unmuted. That
Go ahead,
she
Mimi.
has a question.
No, I'm good. Go.
You're good. Okay.
So I wanted to follow up. When you and I talked, I sent you some pages. We had earlier Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, and he talked about his book, Malady of the Mind.
Yeah.
So I had mentioned that this question of violence, since this is part of the topic for this program, that he had said when it came to mass shootings, if you were saying 4 or more people had been killed, then there was a higher percentage then, just like with higher percentage with substance abuse, of people with mental illnesses that were involved in more people being killed in those kind of shootings. Did you have a chance to look at that? And I want your response if you did.
We should work on the gun side. I feel very strongly that in America, I mean, this is not a problem in Australia. I just want to emphasize. People with untreated psychotic illness don't do mass shootings in Australia. And angry people who've been disappointed by life, which are a much more common American phenomenon, whether they're 18 or 65, don't have access to weaponry. So to me, this question, isn't that satisfying? Because rare things do happen rarely. I'm not going to deny they never happen, right? But it's difficult to make a argument about it. Eric Elbelgen kind of has a different take on it. He said this is a small part of the portfolio. I do want to let you know, before COVID, I was called by every media outlet after every mass shooting. And this is the part of my job that I hated. And again, compare my experience of being inconvenienced with what people are going through. I mean, it's not even in the same universe. But there'd be a mass shooting and I'd say, well, honey, today's going to be a bad day at the office. And I deal with reporters over and over and over again. And I point them to the idea that this was unusual. I point to the MacArthur study. I point them to Eric Elbelgen's work. I try to point them in different directions. And I would ask them, are you interested in how people are coping? Are you interested in how people are dealing with these things? And they said, oh, no, but we'll call you during the next shooting. So I'm not making that up. So this was tax that I paid, the tax that I paid for my amazing job. I love my job. Then COVID happens and no one has asked me that question again. Not one person. So there's a mass shooting. They've all understood either that this is rare, it's rare across the board. Access to guns seems to be a pretty big American thing, right? And now they ask me about how people get better, the book. Can they meet people in the book? They read the book. They love this story. They love that story. So to me, COVID transitioned mental health from a they thing to a we thing.
Wow.
And so I get all these reporters asking me questions about how do people cope? I'm like, oh my God, this is what I've been trying to talk to you guys the whole time about. All you wanted to talk to was mass murder.
Yeah, I get
I'm
that
glad
too.
Australia is so safe. My granddaughter is doing study abroad there, so she should come home safely. I think New Zealand is also a model for gun policies.
And of course, in Australia, they did have a mass murder and they acted to restrict access to weaponry. They actually did the thing. They actually said, oh, we can't have this. So,
I think something else that we should point out here that you referred to is that when you combine psychosis with abuse of alcohol or drugs, things get worse. And we did a podcast about this, and it's something that people don't talk about enough, but I've run into it trying to get help from my son, is once a person has a dual diagnosis, it eliminates the possibility of so many resources because nobody wants to deal with that diagnosis, and that's the one that's dangerous, or at least more connected to
That's the
that.
one for whom there's no design services. So
Exactly.
can I pontificate for a minute on this?
Too.
So you have the AA culture is a peer-driven culture that's suspicious of professionals. That's why when you introduce like something like buprenorphine for opiate addiction, they're like, there's some groups that are like, yeah, that might be a chemical dependency. It's your responsibility. You're the agent for this. Your mother can't call in for you. If you use, you get fired. You're the agent, right? I worked in a dual diagnosis PAC team for 3 years, and I learned a lot about this world. In the mental health field, we don't see it. You're not the agent of your problem. It's not your fault. Something happened to you biologically, and we have loving people who do stuff with you and for you. When you have both of those things, and I did this over and over again, the families are confused about accountability versus support. The individuals are confused, the professionals are confused. So what's interesting is you have these two cultures, one professional, slowly integrating peers, that's the mental health team, and then you have the peer culture, AA, get a sponsor, only you can do it, slowly integrating professionals. Like it's so interesting to me, this clash of cultures. This is fundamentally, I think, a clash of cultures. And integrating
one
them.
of the other things too that I think becomes the big problem too is the whole idea of let him hit rock bottom
Right.
is completely diluted by both
Yeah,
those things existing. Because with mental illness, they tell you that model is out the window. There's no such thing as hitting rock bottom with psychosis. But as soon as alcohol is introduced, it muddies the waters in such a
right.
way.
Hitting rock bottom can mean death.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And, it just, I completely agree with you that this is a big need for a very important population. And because now we're back to the system problems, the funding streams go to this group of people or that group of people. So when I was the state medical director in Massachusetts, the guy I inherited the job from was a super guy. And he said, Ken, we're doing A, we're doing B, we're doing C, doing D. Just do your best. I've got this grant to integrate services with the addiction people. It's not going to work, but you're in charge of it. And your next meeting is next Tuesday. So I go to the meeting and I realize, so I'm the state medical director. Like I have authority over the $800 million and all the patients and all this hospitals and all this stuff. And they send me this person who's like 19 levels down within the Department of Mental Health, Public Health, who had no ability to negotiate anything. And finally, I met with her, was reasonable with her. And after about 3 meetings, I said, what's going on here? And she says, well, every 10 years, you guys try to eat the Bureau of Substance Abuse Services. And then every 10 years, they send a nice guy like you who wants to work with us. We don't know who to trust. So we're not going to do anything with you. I want to emphasize this. So we can meet, we can have coffee. You seem like a perfectly nice man, Ken, but I have no authority to do anything that I've been told or expressly. We're not going to do anything. Because in 1988, you tried to eat our entire budget. I could show you the paperwork. In 1996, you tried to take over the apartment. So, these are funding stream problems at the system level. Now, Ken Minkoff, Ken Minkoff, he runs CCISC, which is Coordinated. Oh my God, I don't know it. He's the leading person in America integrating addiction and mental health services. Ken Minkoff. He's a lovely human being. He's in San Francisco. He's extremely smart.
Let's get that name down, ladies.
Yeah, we're writing it down. Well, we had Stephanie.
Amy's on the ball.
Yeah. All right.
Reach out to Ken. Have him on your show.
We definitely
Tell
will.
him I said hi.
We will. All right. So thank you so much for your insight on this. And I do want to get to the latest research because I know that's a part of your awareness too. And that always gives us hope. Time and time again, get comments. And, by the way, if you're listening on our podcast and looking at the show notes, there is a link to send us fan mail. Of course, you can contact any one of us, Mimi or Mindy or me, through our websites. But if you want to quickly just send fan mail, and people are doing it, which is great. The only thing is we can't answer through our website supplier. So if you're going to write to us, put some contact information in there so we can get back to you. But many of the comments we're getting are, okay, this is great. You know, some of the symptoms are being managed, but we need a cure. We need a cure. This is a brain illness.
No.
So I'm wondering if there's any new research coming out.
Yes, I've got great news on this.
Great.
On September the 26th, the FDA is going to rule on a new compound, which has a completely different mechanism of action. It's called CAR-XT, Kar-XT. You should look it up. This was a compound developed in the 90s by Eli Lilly, thought to help with cognition in Alzheimer's disease. Many people who took it vomited and had diarrhea, and people just stopped the trial. However, I want to identify, we still don't have drugs for Alzheimer's disease. I want to emphasize this. Like, the brain is really hard. This little startup company bought the compound and added a different compound, which doesn't get past your brain, which reduces nausea and vomiting. That's this drug. So it doesn't do dopaminergic stuff. It does the muscarinic receptors in the frontal cortex. And it appears to have effects that are on positive symptoms and cognitive symptoms. And I say that because we've never had a compound that does anything for cognitive symptoms in our history. There is a hint that it works for negative symptoms. I don't want to say it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, but Bristol Myers Squibb paid a company, that biotech startup, $14 billion to purchase that drug. So somebody who's better at money and analytics than me thought an enormous check should be written. So this would be the first novel intervention that we've had in a very long time. And
Wow.
so I'll be doing a Ask the Expert on cognition, on cognitive enhancement therapy, non-drug stuff. But then I'll have a person on who will discuss this drug probably in November or December, like after it's out. It has to be approved by the FDA. I can have no interest in this drug, as I don't drink the water of the pharma companies. I am freaking Snow White, man. I meet with them and listen to them, and they're like, let me buy you a cup of coffee. I'm like, oh, no, you don't. I'm buying my own cup of coffee. NAMI gave me a credit card a couple of years ago because I used to just pay for it myself. So I was like, hey, we got this Mackenzie Scott money. Can I have a credit card? So, now I should buy my own coffee. But I want to emphasize this. I have no interest in this compound at all. NAMI has no interest in it. Our job is to get information out to people.
That's why we value your opinion. And I have two things I'd like you to comment on. One, I'm on the board of Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance.
Of course,
we had a program with them as well. And they gave comments to, I guess, the FDA when it was being vetted, with some pretty serious concerns about some of the vetting that was done. So I wondered if you know anything about that or have anything to say. And if you don't, that's fine too. And then it's my understanding it was not compared to clozapine, and you are one of my go-to people, along with Dr. Laitman, on clozapine. Your support of clozapine is pretty unprecedented nationally for a very long time, and I've taken great stock by that when I've read things you put in the NAMI newsletters and so forth. So was it compared to clozapine? And if so, how did it come out? But also commenting on the vetting of it, if you know anything about that.
A couple things. At the NAMI convention, I have a thing called the clozapine hug, which is like some random person will come up to me and say, we gave Stacy clozapine and we just want you to know she's doing better. And then the mother gives me a hug. It's like the greatest thing in the whole world. It's the greatest thing because it's a pain in the neck to do it. The REM system is a cluster, right? Everything is incented against it. You have to be such a great advocate. You have to be so forceful. Betsy O'Brien, who I'm doing this book event with September 5th, was one of those people who advocated as a mom, put it in the record, I'm requesting clozapine, and then came back a year later and said, hey, did you notice in my record it says I requested a trial of clozapine? And they said, it is in your record, and he's not done well on 2 other medicines, and apparently he's doing fantastic on clozapine. So I'm a big believer in clozapine. There's a hearing at the FDA on November 19th about the problems with REMS. We could talk about Clos Upine. There are problems with REMS, obviously, you know well. It was not compared to Clos Upine. Clos Upine is the only FDA-approved compound for treatment refractory schizophrenia. That would be pretty tough to match it up against the gold standard drug with the most side effects. I mean, what I found with meds is that we learn things in the coming years. That is to say, you do a 6 or 8 or 10-week trial, you're going to learn certain things. We didn't know the second generation antipsychotics cause weight gain. Now, there was a big lawsuit and settlement. Some of them knew it, but didn't tell us. But they did an 8 to 10 week study. People didn't know that Prozac causes sexual dysfunction. Here's how I learned that the SSRI is called sexual dysfunction. And they said, hey, these are antidepressants that don't cause a risk of suicide like the tricyclics. This is great. No side effects. Fantastic. Put it in the water supply. Like, let's go, right? Prozac and all its cousins. So I'm at the Mass Psychiatric meeting and I'm getting coffee. I like coffee. I'm a coffee person. I learn a lot at the coffee table. Hey, did you know my patient has sexual dysfunction? Yeah, that's funny. Mine too. Yeah, that's interesting. I've had 3 patients that can't blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh my God, people didn't self-report this during a short-term trial because they were embarrassed. We now know this is a common phenomenon. So in the case of antipsychotics and weight gain, we were actively deceived by one company, which paid a $2 billion settlement. And I think some of them didn't pick it up. Like in a 6 to 8 week to 10 week trial, you might say, oh, 1.7 pounds of weight gain. What's that? Right? But of course, people are on these compounds for years. So in terms of the trial, I think the FDA is in the best position to assess the trial, right? So did not write anything to the FDA. These people are entrusted with the safety and efficacy of medicines. And I'm not surprised that there are laments about it. You saw MDMA, which people were super hopeful for post-traumatic stress disorder, was shot down by the FDA. People were super hopeful about that. I mean, there was a whole wave of excitement, completely crushed. So the FDA does have the ability to shoot down things that people really, really want. So I haven't gone into the details of the study. I'm extremely interested in September the 26th. The idea of a compound that could help with cognition is an incredible thing. And I'm sure there's complexities, but I haven't delved into the detail. I trust the FDA, which is a statement many people may not endorse. I'm speaking as Ken, not as NAMI, right? I trust the FDA to assess the risk and benefit. I was at the 2003 hearing at the FDA for the black box warning for the antidepressants. And what they did is they had a team from Columbia review every antidepressant trial that had ever been done. It was so exhaustive, the presentation. It was a 2.5-hour presentation about who developed suicidal thoughts and who didn't. No one had died by suicide in any NIMH trial, and they still decided to err on the side of caution by having a black box warning. So to me, I was impressed with their process of really looking at the data and really making a decision. And I think the MDMA decision surprised a lot of us. I mean, I talked to one of the leaders in the psychedelic field. He thought it was definitely going to happen because there's such desperation in the PTSD.
I'm glad to hear your trust in the FDA. I'm one of those people that have been a little bit not as trusting in them after reading the book, The Empire of Pain, and what the Sackler family and the Oxycontin.
The opiate crisis, a whole nother disaster. Yes.
That's a whole nother disaster. But the FDA, and that book was well documented, had a role in that. But you would know more about the mental health drugs. If you were if you had a family member on clozapine or clozapine, I say, would you rush to try this drug, or would you keep them on
don't rush for anything. No rushing. No rushing. So if you have something that's working for somebody you love, do not change anything. If you're going to change something, don't do it when they have a new girlfriend, have lost their job, and are moving to a different place. Don't do that. So I'm very conservative. I did a lot of community psychiatry, and people say, I want to change my meds. And I say, okay, great. Let's find a time when you're not changing one other thing. And they're like, well, I'm starting school in 3 weeks. It's September next week. and I'm going to Roxbury Community College, and okay, Stacy and I aren't getting along, and so I don't know what we're going to do. It's what people say, and I'm like, you got to resolve, start college. We're not going to finish that. Figure it out with Stacy. I don't want to change your meds. It's my opinion. We have to work together. So
I'm glad to hear you say that too. And then I'm going to let Mimi and Randy close out the program. But
so
I just have to
basically,
say,
be gentle with all changes on the brain. Be gentle, and you just have to be gentle. And I don't think there's a cure on the horizon. We don't have a cure for Alzheimer's disease, and the amount of research that has gone into Alzheimer's disease is many hundreds X greater. I can't give you the exact number, but we don't have a treatment because the brain is really, really hard. So I'm sorry to say there will not be a cure in my lifetime. There will not be a cure at all. However, could there be better treatments? No, in my lifetime. Now, I have two daughters in med school. Will there be something in their lifetime? I'm not willing to say. I can't predict the future. But because I haven't seen anything other than one compound, this CAR-T compound, like be a beacon of potential, right? It's really not been a good time for drug discovery, overall, as you know. So.
Okay, well, I was hoping for more hopeful news, but I hope, maybe somebody's working on something, but that was honest.
People are working on it all the time. And NAMI helped to start an AMP Schizophrenia, the Accelerated Medicine Partnership for Schizophrenia, looking for biomarkers for people who convert to psychosis. Like there's a lot of research going on, but it's just humbling how hard this is. I just want to emphasize that. It is so hard. And there's a couple of compounds coming out of the AMP Schizophrenia project. It's hopeful. There's a whole early psychosis movement. I volunteered at one of those programs. This is coordinated specialty care. There's 400 of these programs across America. This is early psychosis. It's fantastic. So there are some hopeful things, but the idea of a biological cure for most brain things has been elusive. Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. These have been really hard for the scientists. While they're coming out with new stents and new immunotreatments for chemotherapy, things below the neck are easier.
On that note, we're out of time. We've been together for almost an hour. I'm going to give everybody a thank you so much. I mean, this was, for your caring and your knowledge and your honesty and the work you do.
Well, thank you. With 101, episodes, right? We should probably dedicate this to some Dalmatian loving family out there. That was such a classic movie in my little family. I can't even tell you. Pongo, old boy. I mean, you couldn't go a day without one of my kids watching Pongo, old boy. Anyway, so 101. So that's a fun little thing. So I want to thank you for all you do. And all the advocacy you do, all the support you do.
We're doing our best with whoever the universe gave us to take care of. That's how I look at it.
I think that's beautifully stated. And there are millions and millions of people who are in this caregiving role. And it's a lot. And by being open and by supporting each other, I think it's a tremendous opportunity to take care of yourself.
Thank you. Well, we can't do it without the experts. So we're all in this together, helping each other with our various skills and expertise. So thank you, Dr. Ken Duckworth, for joining us today. The book is You Are Not Alone, coming out second printing and then in paperback soon. And this is Schizophrenia, 3 Moms in the Trenches. Thank you for joining us. Hey, thanks for joining us for this episode of Schizophrenia, 3 Moms in the Trenches with Randy Kay, Mindy Greiling, and Miriam Feldman. To get in touch with us or to learn more about our books, please visit our websites at miriam-feldman.com, mindygreiling.com, or randykay.com.